We'll delve into the case of a university student who returned home from the library and was never seen again. Right from the start of the investigation, there were numerous unsettling, strange, and even shocking details, which eventually led to a change in state law. But despite all this, the truth remained unknown for decades, and it wasn't until 2024 that the case was finally solved. Tara Baker was born on January 20th, 1977, in East Point, Georgia. Her parents divorced when she was young, and sometime later her mother remarried. Tara had 2 brothers and a sister, making her the oldest of 4. From a very young age, Tara showed a keen interest in the legal system and wanted to become either a lawyer or a judge. She would hold trials with her stuffed animals, make legal contracts with her relatives, and often write letters to various politicians. Once, she even wrote to the President of the United States and complained that his speech had interrupted her favorite TV show. After graduating high school, Tara attended Georgia College. She graduated early in just 3 years, earning 2 bachelor degrees. In 1999, Tara enrolled at the University of Georgia to complete her education. This university was one of the top law schools in the country and was located in a small town called Athens, just a few hours' drive from her parents' home. So it was the perfect choice for Tara. She didn't want to live in a dorm again after college, so she decided to rent off-campus housing instead. She chose a house split into 3 separate rooms for rent. 2 other university students rented the other rooms, one of whom Tara knew well from college. For some time, Tara worked at a prestigious law firm in downtown Athens, which allowed her not only to cover rent and other expenses, but also to gain valuable experience in her future profession. In January 2001, when Tara was 23 and in her second year, she spent a lot of time studying at the university library. The evening of January 18th was no exception. She, along with her friend, went to the library and spent several hours there. Her friend left for home around 7:30 p.m., while Tara decided to stay longer. At approximately 9:46 p.m., she called her friend from the library to check if she had gotten home safely. Tara also mentioned that she planned to head home in a few minutes. The next day, around 6 p.m., her mother, Virginia Baker, received a phone call. At first, she thought someone was playing a prank on her because the caller identified themselves as a detective and asked if her daughter had ever been arrested, as they needed her fingerprints. Thinking it was a joke, Virginia hung up, but then she decided to call the Athens police station. To her surprise, they confirmed that she had indeed spoken to a real detective and informed her that there had been a fire at Tara's house. Still not fully understanding what was going on, Virginia asked to speak to her daughter. The detective replied that they couldn't find her and that an unidentified body had been found in the house, which was why they needed Tara's fingerprints. The detective further explained that they had only been able to locate one of Tara's roommates, who was not home at the time of the fire. The whereabouts of the other roommate and Tara were still unknown, and investigators believed that the body might belong to one of them. Virginia then asked to describe the room where the body was found. The detective's response left her speechless. They said that the room was filled with antique stuff and Tara had been collecting such items for years. Tara's family immediately drove to Athens, hoping it was all just a misunderstanding and that Tara was okay. When they arrived at the police station, they were kept waiting for a long time without any information. Several hours later, a detective finally informed them that the body found in the house belonged to Tara and that she had been murdered, not killed in the fire. The detective then said he was too tired to answer their questions. Before leaving, he added that Tara had left them a gift. Under her nails, experts had found fragments of the perpetrator's skin, which might help identify him. Tara's relatives, shocked by the news of her murder, were left in confusion and despair. Despite their pleas for more information, the police did not provide any further details. The family desperately tried to get some answers, but detectives continued to refuse to share any information with them. Since then, the local police department has never contacted the family, and Tara's relatives had to beg for any information by calling and visiting the station over and over again. They eventually managed to piece together some of what had happened. Around 11 a.m. on January 19th, firefighters were called to Tara's address. After extinguishing the fire, they found a body inside, later identified as Tara Baker. Medical experts concluded that Tara had been murdered. Her body showed signs of strangulation and stab wounds, and she had likely been assaulted. The fire had started after her death, leading investigators to believe that the perpetrators set it to destroy evidence. However, Tara's parents were never able to get the police to show them the medical examiner's report or provide detailed information about the murder. Tara's family also learned that many pieces of evidence might have been destroyed by the firefighters, which is not uncommon in such cases. Their primary goal was to extinguish the blaze and potentially rescue any survivors, and they couldn't have known that there was a murder victim inside. The family also discovered that the investigators likely didn't secure the house after finding the body, allowing anyone to approach or even enter the crime scene. As Tara's relatives gathered these pieces of information, they not only encountered the police's reluctance to keep them informed about the investigation, but also faced constant rudeness and unprofessionalism. At one point, they even started recording their conversations with the police and filed complaints against the local investigators. But this led nowhere. They eventually decided to conduct their own investigation and reached out to a well-known criminologist who agreed to help them. However, the local police department agreed to show him the case materials only on the condition that he would not share any information or findings with anyone outside the investigation, including Tara's relatives. The family hadn't been able to obtain Tara's death certificate for 10 years. It was only after writing to the state governor that they finally received the document. But even then, the detailed cause of death was not listed. It simply stated multiple injuries. Despite all this, the police did continue their investigation, although there were many questionable moments in their actions, which we'll discuss a bit later. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered Tara's body, they called the police. Realizing it was a murder, investigators searched for evidence at the crime scene, but the room was severely damaged by fire and water. As the family later found out, some surviving items were never examined for fingerprints. The police were able to determine that Tara's laptop was missing from her room. Considering it was 2001, the laptop was quite a bulky piece of tech, yet no other valuable items were taken. This raised doubts about the robbery gone wrong motive. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that Tara might have known her killer and let them involuntarily. Despite all this, the police did continue their investigation, although there were many questionable moments in their actions, which we'll discuss a bit later. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered Tara's body, they called the police. Realizing it was a murder, investigators searched for evidence at the crime scene, but the room was severely damaged by fire and water. As the family later found out, some surviving items were never examined for fingerprints. The police were able to determine that Tara's laptop was missing from her room. Considering it was 2001, the laptop was quite a bulky piece of tech, yet no other valuable items were taken. This raised doubts about the robbery gone wrong motive. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that Tara might have known her killer and let them involuntarily. Although the fire and firefighting efforts had damaged the crime scene so much that it was difficult to be certain. Both of Tara's roommates were out of town that evening, so she was home alone. Establishing the time of death was challenging, so medical experts estimated a time frame from 10 p.m. when Tara left the library to 11 a.m. when neighbors called the fire department. The crime likely occurred closer to the morning hours since the fire didn't need much time to spread. The police also found witnesses who saw a middle-aged white man running down the street that morning. He was only wearing a t-shirt and jeans, which was odd given the fact it was winter. They soon found out about a phone call to Tara's university a few days before the murder. The university had a number for requesting student information, like phone numbers, which was used by students themselves or faculty. A man, sounding heavily intoxicated, called and asked for Tara Baker's phone number. He only managed to write it correctly on the 8th attempt. While this was highly suspicious, the man's identity was never determined. At the time of her murder, Tara had a boyfriend who became a person of interest from the very beginning. He provided an alibi that was confirmed, yet the police were reluctant to remove him from their list of suspects. Even after verifying his alibi, they treated him with suspicion, calling him and his parents in the middle of the night and demanding that he come to the station in another city to provide additional biological samples, answer questions, or undergo a polygraph test. It's worth mentioning that it was Tara's boyfriend who had to identify her. He lived in another city and came to Athens immediately upon hearing about the fire. Although Tara's parents were already in town, the police asked the boyfriend to identify her. They brought him directly to the house, but he wasn't allowed inside. Instead, a police officer went in, took a photograph of the body, and showed it to him on the camera screen. Shocked, he said he couldn't be sure if it was Tara. He then mentioned that he had given her earrings, and if he saw them, he could be certain. The officer went back inside, removed the earrings from the body, and showed them to him. Only after that, the boyfriend confirmed they belonged to Tara. The police soon focused their attention on another individual, a student who attended the same classes as Tara and had a troubling reputation. Several female students came forward, saying that he repeatedly asked various girls out on dates and often didn't take no for an answer. He had also asked Tara out multiple times, even though she had been telling him that she had a boyfriend. Some girls also mentioned that this person scared them with his creepy behavior and made them feel uncomfortable. Detectives began to investigate him, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the crime. At one point, they even asked Tara's friend to keep an eye on him, which was a quite controversial move, but it led nowhere. Another suspect was an attorney who worked at the same company as Tara. Talking to her colleagues, investigators found out that shortly before the murder, the man began acting quite strangely. In their company, there was a close-knit group of employees who socialized outside of work pretty often. At some point, this attorney suddenly quit their group. Moreover, just a few days before the incident, he told Tara that he wouldn't be able to attend her birthday celebration, which was scheduled for the day after the murder. On the morning of January 19th, before the fire started, one of Tara's colleagues decided to try and convince him to come to the celebration, since Tara considered him a good friend, and she was hurt by his sudden decision. The colleague went to his office, but he wasn't there. Considering that his workday had already begun, this was strange. He had always been present at the office in the mornings, but on that particular day it wasn't the case. The colleague also checked his work schedule, thinking he might have meetings, but it was empty. He didn't show up that day, but the next day he went to another colleague's house and behaved quite strangely. Many people who knew him suspected that he regularly used illicit substances, which could have explained his behavior. But there was more. The colleague noticed several fresh scratches on his neck. As we remember, skin particles from the perpetrator were found under Tara's nails, which meant that she had probably scratched her attacker. The attorney claimed he was scratched by a cat and denied any involvement in Tara's murder. However, when asked who he thought committed the crime, he acted quite oddly. He started shouting that it was her father, but provided no explanation to support this claim. Another weird thing was that the attorney suddenly resigned just a few months after the murder and left the state. It's unknown whether the police compared his DNA with the samples found under the victim's nails. Moreover, for all these years, there has been no information about whether these samples were even examined. Like with all other parts of the investigation, detectives didn't share any information, not even with Tara's relatives. The police later found out that the attorney was secretly dating two female colleagues from the company, despite being married. This could have explained his strange behavior and absence from work without apparent reasons. Both of these women also claimed they were sure he was using illegal substances. The police weren't able to find any evidence linking him to the murder, and eventually, they stopped considering him a suspect. Detectives also looked into the employees of the maintenance company associated with the house where Tara rented a room. They had spare keys, which could have explained the absence of signs of forced entry, but they couldn't find any leads there either. Since then, there had been no significant progress in the case. The police continued to search for new suspects and witnesses while keeping most details of the investigation in secret, insisting that releasing such information could harm their efforts. Over time, they received several more potential leads. One witness reported seeing an African-American man outside Tara's house a few hours before the fire. Another mentioned seeing blood on a university classmate's notebook shortly after the murder. Police investigated both leads, but they didn't lead anywhere. Tara's parents raised $27,000 and offered it as a reward for any information that could help solve the case. Over the years, almost all detectives working on the case changed. The new team continued their efforts to crack the case, but there were no new breakthroughs. The main issue was the lack of evidence, as the fire and the firefighters' actions destroyed almost everything inside Tara's room that could have been of interest to the investigation. In 2020, 19 years after Tara's murder, a podcast emerged shedding light on her case. Alongside Tara's family and other people involved in the case, this podcast gathered all available information about the crime, sparking a new wave of interest. The police department also took notice of the podcast, leading to increased communication between the new detectives and Tara's family. Thanks to that, the police began working on the case more thoroughly, but there was still no progress. The podcast episodes dedicated to Tara aired for 2 years, significantly impacting the fate of the case. It became one of the reasons why Georgia's government came up with a bill aimed at reducing the number of unsolved cases in state. This bill was named after Tara and another young woman from Georgia whose murder remained unsolved. 18-year-old Rhonda Coleman was found dead in 1990, and her killer has not been found to this day. Even though Rhonda's murder was clearly unrelated to Tara's death, it was decided to name this initiative the Coleman-Baker Bill. In 2023, the bill unanimously passed, and the governor of Georgia came to Athens to sign it in the presence of the families of both victims. The law aimed to establish an unsolved cases unit within the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. It also empowered the family of the victims to request the police to review unsolved cases, re-examine evidence, and take other steps to solve them. As soon as the law was signed in 2023, such a unit was established, specifically focusing on Tara's murder. Detectives reviewed all available information and began examining the few pieces of evidence utilizing modern DNA analysis tools. This went on for several months until May 13, 2024, when the police called a press conference. After 23 years since the murder, they announced that the perpetrator had finally been arrested. The culprit turned out to be a 48-year-old man named Edric Faust. During the conference, investigators didn't disclose how exactly they identified the suspect, only mentioning that modern DNA analysis tools and other biological evidence played a crucial role. They refrained from revealing all details to avoid compromising the ongoing legal proceedings, and only at trial would they disclose what evidence they have against Faust. In Faust's arrest documents, among other charges, he was accused of assaulting the victim, so his biological material could have matched the DNA sample from Tara's body. As we also recall, traces of the assailant's skin were found under the victim's nails, and it's possible that modern tools allowed experts to extract the killer's DNA from it. As for Faust, he likely should have been in the FBI database for a long time due to his extensive criminal record, including numerous arrests for various offenses. At the time of Tara's murder, he was 25 and living in the same city. However, police stated they couldn't find any evidence indicating the suspect knew the victim, suggesting Faust might have broken into her home or convinced her to let him in under some pretext. Detectives also revealed that Faust had never been a suspect in the case and only came under their radar a few days before his arrest thanks to innovative DNA analysis methods. At the moment, Faust remains in jail awaiting trial, and only during the process will we learn what evidence the police were able to find against him. Apparently, detectives did obtain indisputable DNA evidence as Faust was denied bail. They have no doubt that Faust is responsible for Tara's murder, so her case is officially closed. Tara's family, who fought for the truth for 23 years, finally learned what happened to her and thanked the new team of detectives for bringing closure to the case. As for Rhonda Coleman, the other woman after whom the law was named, her case remains unsolved. However, her family can now hope that detectives will discover new evidence and hold the culprit accountable, as it happened in Tara's case. The case of Irene Cortez raises the question, was it a tragic accident or a premeditated killing of a devoted mother? It's often said that a woman betrayed can commit unexpected and desperate acts, with revenge that is cold and merciless. But what happens when the roles are reversed, when it's a man who feels wronged? Some argue that an angry man may lash out physically, turn to alcohol, or do both. However, men, typically seen as less vengeful, can sometimes devise more calculated forms of retaliation. Irene Cortez, a Spanish national who met a mysterious fate while vacationing in Colombia, found herself at the heart of such a mystery. Although several individuals were arrested, tried, and sentenced for her death, her family insists that the true mastermind remains free, casting himself as a victim. To understand this layered case, we must revisit the events from the very beginning and examine whether another party was involved or if her death truly was an accident. It's important to highlight that all parties involved are still attempting to validate their own version of events. Irene Cortez, née Lucas, was born in 1980 in sunny Granada, Spain, the capital city of the province bearing the same name. She was raised in a comfortable, financially stable household alongside her brother and sister. Her parents owned a small yet thriving business. According to some sources, her father died when she was young, after which her mother, Maria Lucas, stepped in to manage and expand the business, ensuring her children were well provided for. Maria's older brother, Pedro Lucas, played a crucial role in supporting the family as well. Irene, the eldest of the siblings, was known for her beauty and outgoing nature. She enjoyed being in the spotlight and caught the attention of boys early on. Not long after finishing school, she got married and was already expecting a child. By the age of 17, Irene became a mother for the first time, and 2 years later, she gave birth to her second child. Thanks to the ongoing support of her mother and uncle, she was able to continue her education and build a solid foundation for her future, despite the challenges of early motherhood. In the early 2000s, Irene relocated to the resort city of Malaga with her husband and their 2 children. There, she launched a small entertainment venue that quickly gained popularity and profitability. What began as a modest disco bar eventually grew into a thriving nightclub. During their time in Malaga, the couple had a 3rd child, and for a while, life appeared stable and prosperous. However, when Irene was just 25, her husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for drug trafficking. Tragically, he died under unclear circumstances while incarcerated. This devastating event left Irene solely responsible for raising their children. Drawing strength from her mother's example, who had also raised 3 children on her own, Irene was determined to endure. She continued to run her business successfully, maintained a strong income, and remained ambitious about building a promising future. Farid Genesaris, originally from Barranquilla, Colombia, was born in 1976. He grew up in a large and financially struggling family, being the youngest among his siblings. During the early 1990s, when Farid was still in his teens, his parents separated. By then, his older siblings had already moved out, and Farid remained with his mother. In 2001, at the age of 25, he and his elderly mother relocated to Spain in hopes of a better future. They settled in Malaga, where Farid took on any work he could find to support them both. By 2005, Farid found employment as a waiter at a nightclub owned by Irene. Irene quickly took notice of Farid's dedication and reliability, and was also drawn to him romantically. Farid reciprocated her interest, doing everything he could to win her favor. At the time, Irene's husband was in prison, and although she intended to divorce him, his unexpected death prevented that from happening. What began as a professional connection between Irene and Farid soon turned into a romantic relationship. Neither Irene nor Farid let their differing circumstances stand in the way. Irene wasn't bothered by Farid's modest background or the fact that she paid a salary, and Farid fully accepted that Irene had 3 children from previous relationships. Within a few months, the two had moved in together. They moved into Irene's spacious apartment. And not long after, she became pregnant with Farid's child. The couple eventually had 2 children together. It's uncertain whether they ever officially married, as Irene continued using her first husband's surname, while the children she had with Farid bore the Genesaris last name. In 2009, history seemed to repeat itself for Irene. Much like her first husband, Farid was arrested for drug trafficking and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Once again, Irene was left to raise her children on her own, this time 5 in total. Although Farid's sentence was 3 years, He was released after serving only a year and a half, thanks to good behavior and his cooperation with authorities. During his time behind bars, Irene found companionship with another man and lived with him throughout Farid's incarceration. Farid discovered Irene's infidelity only after his release. Understandably enraged, he threatened both Irene and her new partner, nearly resorting to violence and risking another legal entanglement. However, the situation was eventually defused, and Farid chose to forgive Irene for the sake of their children. They resumed living together as though the incarceration and betrayal had never occurred. Still, Irene's family remained wary of Farid. Her mother and Uncle Pedro never approved of the relationship, suspecting Farid's true interest lay in Irene's wealth. Additionally, Irene's older children from her first marriage never accepted Farid, although the youngest, whom Farid had raised since the age of 2, viewed him as a father. In early 2011, Farid told Irene he needed to return to Colombia to see his father, who had fallen gravely ill. Reportedly, Farid's estranged father had been diagnosed with advanced cancer, and his sister in Barranquilla had informed him of the grave situation. Irene, who had long wanted to visit Farid's homeland, decided to join him on the trip. She was eager to meet Farid's father, whom she had never encountered, and to experience the famous Barranquilla Carnival, typically held in late February. Additionally, having not taken a vacation for years due to her dedication to work and raising 5 children, Irene saw this trip as a much-needed respite. The couple planned a 10-day overseas trip, arranging for Irene's mother and younger sister to care for the children during their absence. Despite her mother Maria Lucas's attempts to discourage her, citing a bad premonition, Irene chose to proceed with the journey. Meanwhile, the family was struggling financially due to a seasonal slump in their business. Despite the financial struggles, Irene had hidden personal savings of €3,000 in cash at home. However, on the eve of their trip, she discovered the money had mysteriously disappeared, nearly jeopardizing their plans. Quickly, Irene borrowed the needed funds from her uncle and close friends. She then booked their flight tickets and reserved a hotel in the city center, meticulously preparing for what would tragically be her final journey. On February 27, 2011, the couple arrived in Colombia. Their flight was uneventful, and they promptly checked into their hotel. Irene called home to reassure her mother. However, just 2 days later, Farid informed Irene's eldest son, who was 14 at the time, of her death. Initially, Farid described it as an accident, but it soon emerged that Irene had been murdered during a robbery at an entertainment venue in Barranquilla. The case quickly captured significant media attention across Colombia. The official story claimed that Irene, a Spanish tourist, was killed by robbers who then fled the scene, prompting a citywide police search. However, the details of the robbery and murder raised doubts. The attackers didn't seem interested in theft. Instead, they shot Irene directly in the heart before fleeing hurriedly. Police and local media quickly arrived at the scene. Although Farid witnessed the shooting, during a press interview he appeared unusually calm, not matching the typical image of a devastated widower. The Spanish embassy in Bogotá confirmed Irene's murder and stated that her remains would be repatriated once the investigations concluded. The exact events of the night of March 2nd remain unclear and under investigation. Meanwhile, authorities are actively pursuing those responsible for the brutal crime. The case seemed to move toward clarity after police reviewed surveillance footage from cameras near the site of the murder. On March 1st, Irene and her partner Farid Henisaris planned to meet with Farid's brother, sister, and their spouses. The group of 6 enjoyed the carnival festivities, strolling around town before, at Farid's suggestion, heading to a local bar for dinner and entertainment. By 1 a.m., only Irene, Farid, and his relatives remained at the bar, as clearly shown in surveillance footage. Around 2 a.m., 2 young men seated apart from the group entered the bar. They didn't order anything and appeared uneasy, which drew the attention of the bar manager due to their suspicious behavior. Additionally, their youthful appearance prompted the manager to check if they were of legal age. The young men refused to show identification, and when asked to leave, one pulled out a gun and aimed it at the manager. His accomplice produced a knife but soon disappeared from the camera's view. The armed attacker shoved the manager aside and approached Irene's table, declaring a robbery and demanding mobile phones and cash. His partner, who was wielding a knife, reappeared, likely intending to gather valuables, while the gunman kept the group under threat. However, the gunman didn't get the chance to act further. Confronting Irene, he ordered Farid to stand aside for a pocket search. As Irene reached for her purse, the assailant suddenly lunged with the gun hand and fired a shot, hitting her directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor as the attackers fled empty-handed. Farid and his brother gave chase, while his sister attempted to stem Irene's bleeding and his brother's wife called emergency services. Unfortunately, the culprits escaped too quickly to be caught. The men returned to the bar to assist Irene, but it was already too late. Emergency responders arrived promptly, but Irene tragically died from her injuries on the way to the hospital, leaving behind a devastated family and a puzzling case. Following the robbery and murder, law enforcement mobilized all available resources. With the city crowded with carnival tourists, ensuring public safety was a top priority. Authorities announced a reward of 10 million pesos, approximately 3,500 euros, for information leading to the suspects. The first suspect, gunman Brian Dario, was captured the very next day and quickly named his accomplice Juan Carlos. Juan, 18 years old, surrendered to the police hoping for leniency. During interrogation, Dario explained that financial hardship, debts, and a sick child requiring expensive treatment drove him to commit the crime, a claim supported by his relatives. He insisted that the shooting of Irene was accidental, happening during the attempt to grab her purse. Juan Carlos maintained that he was an unwitting participant. He stated that Brian never disclosed his full plan but requested backup for a job. He claimed to carry only a small knife meant for intimidation, not violence, and said he left the scene once he realized Brian's true intentions. However, surveillance footage contradicted this, showing him returning to Brian. With both suspects in custody and their confessions, the case seemed closed and prison sentences were expected. The court convicted Dario of robbery and homicide with aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to 23 years. Carlos was given 17 years for his role as an accomplice. Accusations against Farid and emerging crime details. From the start of the investigation, Irene's family openly accused Farid of orchestrating the murder. Her mother and uncle hired a private detective to conduct an independent inquiry, gathering additional evidence to hold Farid accountable and prove his involvement. One key point was the earlier disappearance of 3,000 euros from Irene's home. Maria Lucas insisted that only Farid was aware of the hidden money, and he was the only person capable of taking it without raising suspicion. She had warned her daughter about this from the start, but Irene chose not to believe her. Now, Maria was convinced that Farid used the stolen funds to pay Dario to murder his wife. Another compelling point was the fabricated story about Farid's father's illness. It was revealed that the elderly man was never diagnosed with cancer and was in relatively good health for his age. Farid had invented this lie as the main excuse for their trip to Colombia. Additionally, Farid was the one who suggested visiting the ill-fated venue and insisted on staying late into the night, long after other patrons had left, leaving their group alone in the establishment. The detective also carried out a thorough analysis of the surveillance footage, offering his assessment of the events and drawing his own conclusions. The detective observed unusual behavior from the criminals. Juan appeared visibly frightened and seemed confused about what was happening, while Brian confidently approached the group, came up to Farid, and grabbed him without directly threatening him with the gun. It gave the impression that the men were familiar with each other and acted in coordination. Then, in a strange move, Farid positioned himself behind Irene, who was seated at the table. As Irene reached into her bag for her wallet, the gunman glanced at Farid, seemingly waiting for a signal. It's unclear whether Farid actually gave any signal, as both he and Irene had their backs to the camera. After the shot was fired, Farid pursued the assailant, but the expert speculated that he may have deliberately allowed the shooter to escape. However, this opinion is debatable, given that Brian was armed with a gun and Farid could have reasonably feared for his own safety. Questions also arose about Farid's behavior after Irene was declared dead. He willingly gave interviews to reporters, openly discussing the details of the incident, yet he didn't appear genuinely upset or devastated. Another puzzling detail was why, following the tragedy, Farid chose to call Irene's 14-year-old son, not her mother, uncle, or any adult relatives, to inform him about his mother's death. According to Maria Lucas, Farid's intention was to personally inflict emotional pain on the teenager as punishment for not recognizing his authority as a stepfather and for showing him disrespect. Irene's uncle, Pedro Lucas, was the first family member to speak publicly about his suspicions and the findings from his own investigation. He firmly believed that Farid had premeditated the trip, essentially setting a trap for Irene. The money stolen from her was allegedly used to pay a hired assassin, and after her death, Farid planned to gain custody of the children and take control of Irene's business. Farid's mother refused to quietly accept the accusations against her son and publicly defended him. She insisted that Farid was deeply in love with Irene and her children and would never have harmed her. However, she inadvertently revealed a sensitive detail, mentioning that Irene didn't have to be unfaithful to Farid, as such betrayal deeply wounded his pride. Additionally, a troubling fact came to light. Farid allegedly left Spain using forged documents because he was not permitted to travel abroad due to being recently released on parole. Farid denied these claims, insisting that he left the country legally and that Irene had acted as his guarantor. 12 days after the tragedy, Irene's body was brought back to her homeland in Spain. The funeral was held with a closed casket due to the advanced decomposition of her remains. Hundreds gathered to pay their respects. Family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard of the case and wished to offer their condolences. The only notable absence was Farid himself, who feared returning from Colombia due to concerns over possible retaliation. He claimed that Irene's relatives had repeatedly threatened both him and his elderly mother. Because of this, before traveling back to Spain, he planned to seek protection from the authorities. Farid sought a protective order to attend the funeral, but his request was denied, leading him to decide against taking the risk of returning. In response, he filed a court complaint accusing his late wife's relatives of obstructing his return home. However, Maria and Pedro Lucas refuted these allegations, insisting their priority was ensuring Farid faced trial in Spain. Amid these new developments and accusations, further investigations and court proceedings were launched. Dario and Carlos, already imprisoned in Colombia, were questioned about any connection to Farid and whether there had been a planned conspiracy. Despite this, Brian firmly denied any such involvement, maintaining that the murder was an unintended outcome of a botched robbery attempt. Brian insisted he had never met Farid before, much less been hired as a hitman to kill his wife. The accusations seemed largely speculative, lacking concrete evidence of premeditation or a contract killing, relying mostly on assumptions and interpretations of the surveillance footage. Brian also admitted he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs that night, which explained his unclear memory of the events. Meanwhile, Carlos maintained that Brian never involved him in any plans, and that the events at the bar shocked him just as much as everyone else. One appeared truthful, but Brian's account, the one who fired the shot, raised suspicions. Consider this. Although he botched the robbery and ended up in prison, his sick child still received the costly treatment needed. Brian claimed that generous strangers, upon learning his motive, helped fund his child's care. However, the Lucas family's lawyers argued that the €3,000 stolen from Irene, which Farid supposedly paid to have her killed, was actually used for that treatment. They suggested Brian agreed to take the fall and serve time in prison to protect his child while secretly funneling the money to his wife. This version, however, was never substantiated. Genosaurus chose to return to Spain only after securing a court order that guaranteed his safety. Several months had passed since the tragedy, and the media storm had calmed down. Upon his return, Genosaurus claimed to bring evidence supporting his innocence in his wife's murder. He stated that his primary reason he was unemployed, his passport had been revoked, preventing him from leaving the country, and, to make matters worse, his friends had abandoned him. Additionally, Irene's mother and uncle barred him from seeing his children. Genosaurus frequently clashed with Maria and Pedro Lucas in court, accusing them of threatening him while they sought to prove his role in Irene's murder. However, neither party was able to provide solid evidence to support their accusations. In the end, the children stayed under the care of their grandmother and uncle, and the widower was denied any rights to his late wife's estate. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant. The story of young Costa Rican Mariam Vallejo shook the entire country, leaving even the most composed people stunned. What started as a seemingly ordinary argument turned into a tragic event that could not be undone. Those who thought they knew her story soon discovered deeper truths, a world filled with manipulation, toxic relationships, and love games that often cross dangerous boundaries. Mariam had hoped to keep her family united, but her love ultimately cost her life. What really happened on that tragic day? And who holds the responsibility for her death? Unhealthy relationships aren't worth the fight or the effort to salvage. At their core, they're like living on a powder keg, ready to explode with ongoing arguments, manipulation, bitterness, and attempts to control. A harmful partner may not only use physical violence, but also cause emotional damage. This often shows up as breaking down their partner's self-esteem, making them feel worthless, inadequate, and convinced they cannot live without them. Through constant criticism and demeaning behavior, they undermine their partner's achievements and destroy their sense of identity. Such a relationship brings only pain, disappointment, and a lack of hope for any future together. But who was Mariam Vallejo? Mariam Andrea Fernandez Vallejo was born on February 19, 1998, in Heredia, the capital city of the province with the same name in Costa Rica. She was the eldest of 3 siblings in the family of Douglas Fernandez Aguilaro and his wife, Ivania Marietta Vallejo. Her parents worked tirelessly to provide their children with everything they needed, ensuring they received a good education and grew up to be honorable individuals. From an early age, Mariam stood out for her striking beauty, which became even more pronounced as she matured. By her teenage years, she possessed a model-like appearance, long black hair, large expressive eyes, a perfectly symmetrical face, and an impeccable figure. It was no surprise that Mariam attracted many admirers competing for her attention. Those who knew her described Mariam as intelligent, cheerful, outgoing, and kind-hearted, always willing to lend a hand. She excelled in her studies and dreamed of a career in journalism and social communications. She enrolled at a prestigious university in San Jose, where she pursued editorial work and broadcast journalism. Her parents were proud of their eldest daughter, confident she would succeed in her chosen path. However, shortly after starting her studies in the capital, Mariam began a relationship that, sadly, would bring her nothing but hardship. Her family sensed the danger early on, but blinded by love, Mariam refused to heed their warnings. So who was Marvin Bernays? Marvin Alonso Bernays was born in 1992 in San Jose and was the eldest of 2 children in a wealthy and prominent family. His parents owned a large chain of pharmacies and several department stores in the capital city. Marvin grew up very close to his younger sister, and the two always supported each other. As a child, Marvin was spoiled and demanding, never being denied anything he wanted. His parents consistently excused his behavior and shielded him from the consequences of his actions, no matter how serious. This lack of limits allowed Marvin to develop destructive habits early on. During his teenage years, he became involved with alcohol and illegal substances. He regularly attended parties at popular spots, had many brief relationships, and lived without any clear plans for the future, relying entirely on his parents' wealth. His parents gave him an expensive car, which he often drove recklessly and while under the influence, frequently landing in trouble. When his parents realized they had lost control over him, they threatened to take away the car and cut him off financially. But Marvin knew very well that they would never follow through, so he continued to disregard their warnings. By the time Marvin reached 20, the once skinny young man had started paying close attention to his appearance. He became a regular at the gym, focusing on building muscle. This new dedication to fitness led him to quit using illegal substances and drastically reduce his alcohol intake. Soon another passion surfaced. Marvin began adorning his body with bold, colorful tattoos. However, after a few years, his enthusiasm for fitness waned. Convinced that his physique was already perfect, he stopped working out and slipped back into his old habits of wild parties, heavy drinking, and substance use. With his expensive car, designer clothes, and lavish spending of his parents' money, Marvin easily attracted women, many of whom approached him first, drawn by his flashy lifestyle. There's no clear record of how Marvin and the reserved beauty Miriam first crossed paths. Some sources say they were introduced by mutual friends who invited Miriam to a party, while others claim Marvin discovered Miriam's social media profile, was immediately drawn to her beauty, showered her with compliments, and quickly asked her out. Their relationship, which began in February, was rocky from the very beginning. Marvin treated Miriam like she belonged to him, and even his affectionate gestures often had an edge of aggression and control. For example, he would pinch her hard enough to leave bruises or grab her chin roughly during conversations to force her to look at him. Their private moments were no different, reflecting this troubling dynamic. Miriam once told a close friend that Marvin had a habit of choking her, insisting it was playful. But there were times when his behavior crossed the line, leaving her genuinely scared for her life. Still, Miriam, inexperienced in relationships, saw Marvin as her first serious boyfriend, her first great love, and the first man in her life. Naive and unaware of the danger she faced, she convinced herself that Marvin would never truly hurt her. She explained away his behavior as an unusual way of showing affection and was willing to forgive him. When Miriam introduced Marvin to her parents for the first time, they immediately sensed something was off. They were disturbed by how Marvin treated their daughter. His manner was rough and disrespectful, even in front of them. They couldn't help but worry about what might happen when the two were alone. Douglas and Ivania tried to reason with Miriam, urging her to end the relationship because they believed it would lead to nothing good. Marvin seemed immature to them, lacking ambition and any clear direction or goals for the future. But Miriam defended him passionately, insisting he was a good person who loved her deeply, even if his way of expressing it was unconventional. She believed he was simply trying to find his way in life. With no other option, her parents reluctantly accepted Miriam's decision and hoped for the best. Her friends grew increasingly worried after she started dating Marvin. The once lively and outgoing young woman became a mere shadow of herself. It seemed her entire life now revolved around her boyfriend, and she wouldn't go anywhere or speak to anyone without his permission. Friends also noticed bruises on her body, but Miriam always dismissed them as accidents or clumsiness. In October 2016, news broke that Miriam was pregnant. The announcement shocked her parents, her boyfriend, and even Miriam herself. At just 18 years old, the university student and her boyfriend were completely unprepared for such a life-changing event. Still, Miriam quickly decided to keep the baby. Her parents, Ivania and Douglas, supported her choice and promised to help raise their grandchild. They encouraged Miriam not to drop out of university and strongly advised her against marrying the baby's father. Marvin pressured Miriam to terminate the pregnancy, but when he realized she was determined to keep the baby, his behavior became increasingly controlling. He began telling her she would never be free from him. After discovering the pregnancy, Marvin's treatment of Miriam worsened. He openly cheated on her, spent nights partying with alcohol and drugs, yet still closely monitored her every move. He insulted her whenever he could, making cruel remarks about how she would soon gain weight, become awkward, and lose her attractiveness. Marvin repeatedly told Miriam that no one else would want her, and if she left him, she would be alone forever. Despite the constant verbal abuse and emotional torment, Marvin desperately pushed Miriam to marry him. He framed his proposal as a selfless act, claiming he wanted to protect her from the stigma of being a single mother. But his actions revealed no genuine care or compassion. When Miriam felt unwell, Marvin told her to stay away and not bother him with her problems. In mid-December 2016, Despite all the warnings from her loved ones, Miriam agreed to marry Marvin. However, Marvin's parents opposed the marriage as well. They refused to provide any financial support to the young couple, believing Miriam had intentionally gotten pregnant to exploit their family's wealth. They even threatened to disown their grandchild. Without financial stability or a place to live, the couple had no choice but to accept help from Miriam's parents. Douglas and Ivania allowed them to move into their home temporarily, either until the baby was born or until Marvin found a job and could afford their own place. Miriam's parents covered all expenses, effectively supporting their pregnant daughter and her unemployed husband, who was a domestic type. Marvin was irresponsible, lazy, and disrespectful. With many bad habits, he had no intention of changing. He freely took advantage of Miriam's parents' generosity, eating their food, borrowing money, and continuing his carefree bachelor lifestyle. Even worse, Marvin would insult and humiliate Miriam in front of her family. Whenever her parents confronted him, Miriam always stood up to defend her husband. One day, during another heated argument, Marvin grabbed Miriam by the neck and began choking her. Her father, Douglas, saw what was happening, rushed to help his daughter, and struck Marvin several times. In response, Marvin shouted insults at the entire family and declared he would never set foot in their home again. He packed his things and, despite the tears and pleas of his pregnant wife, walked away. From that day on, Miriam cried constantly and rarely left her room. She blamed her father for the incident and accused her parents of interfering in her marriage. Even after everything, Miriam failed to see the danger in Marvin's behavior and his physical violence, even during her pregnancy, and held on to the hope that they could still build a happy future together. About a week before her due date, Marvin, who hadn't contacted Miriam in nearly 4 months, suddenly showed up at the Vallejo family's doorstep. He claimed to have reflected on his behavior and said he was now ready to take responsibility for their child and support the family. Marvin apologized to Miriam and her parents but made it clear he had no plans to move back into their home. In July 2017, Miriam gave birth to a baby girl named Luciana. The father visited them at the hospital only once and then disappeared for another month. When he finally appeared at Miriam's parents' home, it was obvious his behavior hadn't changed. At times, Marvin showed up drunk or under the influence of drugs. He acted aggressively, insulted everyone, and refused to leave when asked. He frequently asserted his parental rights and even threatened legal action to take Luciana away, boasting about his family's wealth and connections. Shockingly, he also demanded that Miriam fulfill her marital duties. Most troubling of all, Marvin continued to closely monitor Miriam's every move. He demanded to know where she went, who she met, and what she did, keeping tight control over her life and treating her like his possession. Despite all this, divorce was never even brought up. The first criminal incident occurred on the evening of December 23, 2017, when Marvin showed up at the Vallejo family home, supposedly to visit his daughter. From the moment he arrived, he appeared agitated and ready to start a fight. When he approached the crib and saw their baby asleep, his frustration exploded. He began yelling, accusing Miriam of purposely putting their 5-month-old daughter to bed early to keep him away. Marvin's anger intensified as he violently shook the crib, waking and frightening the baby. Miriam hurried to soothe Luciana and begged Marvin to leave. Instead, he threatened to take their daughter away and never let Miriam see her again. Their argument quickly escalated, and suddenly Marvin grabbed Miriam by the neck, forcing her to the floor as he started choking her. At the time, they were in an upstairs bedroom while the rest of the family was downstairs, unaware of the disturbance. Miriam couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and couldn't call for help. She felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, convinced she wouldn't survive. Just as she was bracing for the worst, her father, Douglas, entered the room to check on them. For a moment, Douglas froze at the sight of Marvin attacking his daughter. Then, without hesitation, he rushed at his son-in-law, pushing him off Miriam and saving her life. Marvin shouted insults and threats as he stormed out of the house. It took Miriam nearly half an hour to calm down and regain her breath after the ordeal. The next day, She finally gathered the courage to go to the police and report the assault and attempted crime. She presented evidence of bruises, defensive wounds on her arms, and clear finger and palm marks on her neck. The injuries unmistakably showed she had been attacked and strangled. Authorities took her statement seriously and promptly moved to arrest Marvin. However, soon after his arrest, Marvin's parents and sister visited Miriam's home, begging her to drop the charges. They accused her of trying to destroy the life of their child's father and used every emotional tactic to persuade her. Under this pressure, Miriam relented and withdrew her statement the next day. As a result, Marvin faced no consequences for his actions. A deadly reconciliation and a mysterious death followed. About 6 weeks after the incident, Marvin began pleading with Miriam to reconcile and live together as a family for the sake of their daughter. Despite her parents' strong objections, Miriam eventually chose to give him another chance. Still deeply in love with him, Miriam clung to the hope that Marvin would change and finally take responsibility for his actions. This time, the couple moved into a cozy country house owned by Marvin's family. He insisted they couldn't live under Miriam's parents' roof anymore, claiming they interfered too much in their relationship. They relocated to their new home on March 18, 2018. But just 11 days later, a devastating tragedy ended the young mother's life. On that fateful day, the couple reportedly had another intense argument. According to Marvin, Miriam locked herself in the bathroom and turned up the music loudly. After about 15 minutes, Marvin knocked on the door and called her name but got no response. He then forced the door open with his shoulder and found Miriam unconscious on the floor. Marvin tried to revive her but, for reasons unknown, did not immediately call emergency services. Instead of calling emergency services, Marvin's first call was to his mother. Consequently, Marvin's mother and sister were the first to arrive at the scene. Only after they showed up did someone finally call for an ambulance, but precious time had already been lost. When paramedics arrived, they found Miriam's body lying naked on the bathroom floor. She had multiple bruises, a visible head wound bleeding, and blood pooling beneath her. First, it seemed she might have slipped and fallen. However, defensive wounds on her arms and bruising around her neck suggested something far more sinister. While paramedics worked urgently to stabilize Miriam, Marvin's mother and sister began cleaning the bathroom as if nothing unusual had happened. One of the paramedics found their behavior deeply suspicious and alerted the police. By the time law enforcement arrived, the bathroom had been thoroughly cleaned with detergents, likely destroying crucial evidence. Meanwhile, Miriam was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors managed to restart her heart twice, but after a third cardiac arrest, there was nothing more they could do. Miriam's parents, Ivania and Douglas, arrived just in time to witness their daughter's final moments. Later, Ivania recalled how her son-in-law had called her earlier that day in a disturbingly calm tone, informing her that Miriam was in critical condition in the ICU. Instinctively, she knew something terrible had happened. She screamed for her husband, and they hurried to the hospital. Upon arrival, they were told Miriam had likely suffered a severe beating, but only an autopsy could confirm the exact cause of death, an attempt to cover up a crime. To everyone's shock and frustration, the autopsy results failed to conclusively determine the cause of the 20-year-old's death. The official report given to the family stated she likely died from a traumatic brain injury caused by a fall. The tragedy was initially ruled an accident, with no mention of the bruises on her body or the strangulation marks on her neck. Ivania and Douglas, now raising their 9-month-old granddaughter, knew the Bernays family was leveraging their wealth and influence to protect the man responsible for their daughter's death and keep him out of prison. Refusing to accept this injustice, the Vallejo family launched their own investigation. For months after Miriam's tragic passing, they finally obtained an official report confirming the cause of death as mechanical asphyxiation. She had been strangled with bare hands. Marvin was arrested on charges of killing his wife only in late July 2018. Until then, he had remained free, continuing his carefree bachelor lifestyle, attending parties, and living off his parents' money. He was reportedly shocked when the police showed up at his home, believing he had escaped any consequences. From that point, the investigation into Miriam's death gained momentum. However, piecing together the events proved incredibly difficult due to the months that had elapsed. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the crime scene had been thoroughly cleaned, and the house was later rented out, making any search for evidence futile. Consequently, the investigation shifted focus to collecting evidence and witness testimonies. Formal charges against Marvin were filed in November 2019, accusing him of committing the crime under aggravating circumstances. Many witnesses, including friends and family of the victim, testified that Marvin had repeatedly abused Miriam, physically attacking her, demeaning her, and exerting obsessive control over her life. Miriam's father recalled how, months ago, before her death, Marvin had already attempted to strangle her, with Douglas intervening just in time to prevent another tragedy. The story of Miriam's earlier police report also resurfaced, how she had filed a complaint about an assault only to withdraw it the next day under pressure from the Bernays family. Ivania also shared further accounts of Marvin's abusive behavior. On multiple occasions, Ivania recounted, Marvin pushed Miriam so forcefully that she was injured when she fell. A paramedic who responded to the emergency on the day of Miriam's death also noted inconsistencies in Marvin's story. Marvin claimed that Miriam had locked herself in the bathroom, forcing him to break the door down with his shoulder. However, the paramedic observed that the bathroom door lock was intact, with no signs of forced entry. Had Marvin truly broken down the door, there would have been visible damage consistent with such an act. Another suspicious detail was the thorough cleaning of the bathroom right after Miriam was taken to the hospital. Although Marvin's mother and sister denied cleaning it, the timing and nature of their actions raised serious doubts. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy found numerous bruises, abrasions, and injuries consistent with prolonged, severe physical abuse. When confronted with this evidence, Marvin admitted that their argument that day had turned physical. However, he claimed that Miriam started the fight, saying she insulted him and hit him in the face first. Marvin stated that he only struck Miriam a few times in self-defense and did not cause any serious injury. The trial, custody dispute, and final verdict. Marvin Burnett's trial commenced in January 2017. He vehemently denied any responsibility for Miriam's death and shared his account of events. He explained that both he and Miriam were overwhelmed upon learning they were expecting a child, but that he was committed to taking responsibility, which is why he married her. Marvin further claimed their relationship began to unravel after moving in with Miriam's parents. He accused his in-laws of constantly interfering in their marriage, which fueled tension and conflict between him and Miriam. According to Marvin, the situation worsened after their daughter's birth, as he alleged Miriam suffered from postpartum depression, which supposedly caused her behavior to become unpredictable. Marvin described Miriam as sometimes aggressive and dangerous, even at times close to self-harm. He claimed the only solution was for them to move to a separate home. However, shortly after relocating, the tragic event took place. According to Marvin's account, after their final argument, Miriam went to take a bath, slipped, fell, and hit her head, which caused her death. To support this defense, Marvin's lawyer hired an independent medical expert who challenged the official findings and argued that the cause of death was a head injury from an accidental fall. Despite this, the court ultimately dismissed that claim. Marvin's sister testified in court, attempting to depict Miriam as mentally unstable, aggressive, and obsessed with her brother for financial gain. Marvin's mother supported this narrative, asserting that Miriam had ongoing mental health issues and backing the theory that her death was accidental. She claimed to have repeatedly warned Miriam about the slippery bathroom floor and recommended using an anti-slip mat, which Miriam allegedly ignored, resulting in the fatal fall. Additionally, the Bernays family declared their intention to pursue custody of Luciana, arguing that, as the child's paternal relatives, they had superior rights over the Vallejo family. On January 27, 2020, the court found Marvin Bernays guilty of premeditated homicide with aggravating circumstances and sentenced him to 50 years in prison. Despite the defense's efforts to portray Miriam's death as an accident, the evidence conclusively showed that she died from mechanical asphyxiation. In addition to the lengthy prison term, Marvin was ordered to pay nearly $700,000 in compensation to Miriam's family for the emotional distress caused by his actions. Throughout the sentencing, Marvin remained detached and showed no remorse or admission of guilt. In his final statement, he blamed the media coverage of the case for his conviction, claiming that the public portrayal of him as a monster had biased the judicial process in favor of the Vallejo family. All his appeals against the verdict have been denied, and the sentence stands firm. Despite the harsh sentence, Marvin Bernays benefits from his family's wealth and influence, allowing him to serve his prison term under comparatively lenient conditions. Reports say his cell resembles a comfortable hotel room, complete with access to a gym and high-quality meals, a stark contrast to the typical incarceration experience. Meanwhile, the Bernays family remains determined to gain custody of Luciana, pushing legal battles to wrest the child from Miriam's family. Marvin, with the support of his lawyer, is preparing yet another appeal, hoping to overturn or reduce his sentence. The fight for justice and custody continues, casting a long shadow over the aftermath of this tragic case. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant. Saffron Callahan was a force to be reckoned with. From a young age, she exhibited a fierce determination and an insatiable curiosity that set her apart from her peers. Born to Liam and Fiona Callahan, Saffron's early years were marked by instability. Her father's struggle with alcoholism and her mother's subsequent depression created a tumultuous home environment. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Saffron developed a resilience and drive that would shape her future. At school, Saffron excelled academically and socially. She was editor of the school newspaper, captain of the debate team, and a straight-A student. Her teachers often remarked on her ability to see through facades and uncover hidden truths, a skill that would later draw her to journalism. When her parents divorced during her sophomore year of college, Saffron found herself at a crossroads. Unwilling to choose between her parents and needing a stable environment to continue her studies, she accepted her Uncle Everett and Aunt Constance's offer to live with them. Moving into the Callahan family home was a turning point for Saffron. For the first time, she experienced the stability and support she had always craved. Everett, in particular, took an interest in nurturing her talents, often engaging her in discussions about politics, business, and current events. Everett Callahan was the epitome of the American dream. At 45, he had built a real estate empire from the ground up, transforming it into one of the most successful firms in the Northeast. His magnetic personality and sharp business acumen had earned him both admirers and enemies in equal measure. Standing tall with salt and pepper hair, Everett cut an imposing figure. He had a way of commanding any room he entered, his charm and wit drawing people in like moths to a flame. Everett's childhood had been markedly different from his current life of luxury. Growing up in a working-class family, he had learned the value of hard work and ambition from an early age. His father, a construction worker, and his mother, a waitress, had instilled in him a drive to succeed that bordered on obsession. After putting himself through college and business school, Everett had thrown himself into the world of real estate. His ability to spot potential where others saw only dilapidation had quickly set him apart from his peers. Within a decade, he had transformed the company from a small local firm into a regional powerhouse. To the outside world, Everett appeared to have it all. A beautiful wife, 2 children, a successful business, and a reputation as a pillar of the community. He served on the boards of several charities and was a generous donor to local causes. However, beneath this perfect exterior lurked a restlessness that Everett struggled to quell. Despite his outward success, Everett battled with a persistent feeling of emptiness. The thrill of closing deals and amassing wealth had begun to wane, leaving him searching for new sources of excitement. Everett's relationship with his niece, Saffron, added another layer of complexity to his life. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who shared his drive and ambition. As she grew older, he found himself drawn to her in ways that both excited and disturbed him. The line between avuncular affection and something more sinister began to blur, setting the stage for the tragedy that was to come. It was a crisp autumn evening when Saffron's world turned upside down. She had been working late at the local newspaper where she had secured an internship when she realized she had left her laptop charger at home. Knowing her aunt and uncle were supposed to be at a charity gala that evening, she decided to swing by the house to retrieve it. As Saffron pulled into the driveway, she noticed her uncle's car parked in its usual spot. Thinking he must have decided to skip the gala, she entered the house quietly, not wanting to disturb him if he was working in his study. The house was eerily quiet as Saffron made her way upstairs. As she approached her room, she heard sounds coming from her uncle's bedroom. Concern and curiosity warred within her as she inched closer to the partially open door. What Saffron saw through the crack in the door would haunt her for the rest of her short life. There was her Uncle Everett, locked in a passionate embrace with a woman who was decidedly not her Aunt Constance. Saffron's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was witnessing. The uncle she had idolized, the man she had seen as a paragon of virtue and success, was nothing but a common cheater. Backing away from the door, Saffron's foot caught on a loose floorboard, causing a loud creak. Her heart stopped as she heard the sudden silence from the bedroom. Without thinking, she dashed down the stairs and out of the house, barely remembering to close the front door behind her. Once in her car, Saffron sat trembling, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Shock, anger, and a strange sense of betrayal fought for dominance. She had always thought of her uncle as invincible. Above the petty weaknesses of ordinary men, to see him engaged in such a tawdry affair shattered the pedestal she had placed him on. In the days that followed, Saffron found herself obsessively analyzing every interaction she had ever had with her uncle. She began to see hidden meanings in casual touches, to reinterpret compliments and gestures of affection through a new, unsettling lens. The knowledge of Everett's affair became a poisonous secret, eating away at Saffron from the inside. She found herself unable to meet her uncle's eyes at the dinner table, flinching away from his usual affectionate pat on the shoulder. Her aunt noticed the change in Saffron's behavior, but attributed it to stress from her internship and upcoming job search. Little did anyone know that this discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. Veronica Ashworth was not the type of woman one would typically imagine as the other woman in an extramarital affair. At 38, she was a respected art curator at the Museum of Art in Hartford. Her professional demeanor and sophisticated taste made her a favorite among the city's elite, who often sought her advice on building their private collections. With her sharp features and penchant for minimalist designer clothing, Veronica cut a striking figure. She was intelligent, cultured, and fiercely independent, qualities that had initially drawn Everett to her. Their paths had first crossed at a museum fundraiser 2 years prior. Everett had been immediately captivated by Veronica's wit and her refreshingly direct manner. For her part, Veronica had found in Everett a man who could keep up with her intellectually, something she had found lacking in many of her previous relationships. What had begun as a meeting of minds soon evolved into a physical relationship. They would meet in upscale hotels during business trips or steal moments together when Everett claimed to be working late. Veronica, who had sworn off serious relationships after a painful divorce in her early 30s, found herself falling for the charismatic real estate mogul. However, Veronica was not naive. She knew Everett was married and had no illusions about their relationship. She told herself that she was satisfied with the stolen moments and passionate encounters, that she didn't need or want the complications of a full-time relationship. Yet, as the affair continued, Veronica found herself increasingly dissatisfied with the secrecy and limitations of their arrangement. She began to hope, against her better judgment, that Everett might leave his wife for her. Little did Veronica know that her affair with Everett was about to be thrust into the spotlight in the most tragic way possible. The discovery of their relationship would set off a chain reaction that would end in murder, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. In the weeks following her discovery of Everett's affair, Saffron found herself spiraling into a dark obsession. Her once bright future seemed to dim as she became consumed with thoughts of her uncle and the mysterious other woman. Saffron's work at the newspaper began to suffer. As she spent countless hours scouring social media and local event photos trying to identify the woman she had glimpsed in Everett's bedroom, her search became all-consuming, causing her to neglect her responsibilities and withdraw from her friends and family as she delved deeper into her investigation. Saffron began to experience a disturbing shift in her emotions. The initial shock and disgust at her uncle's infidelity gradually gave way to a complex mix of jealousy and desire. She found herself imagining what it would be like to be the object of Everett's illicit affections, to be the one he risked everything for. These thoughts both thrilled and horrified Saffron. She knew they were wrong, that the very idea of being attracted to her uncle was taboo. Yet she couldn't shake the growing fixation. She began to pay more attention to her appearance when she knew Everett would be around, wearing more makeup and choosing outfits that accentuated her figure. Saffron's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Her Aunt Constance expressed concern over her niece's sudden mood swings and distracted demeanor. Everett, too, seemed to sense the change in Saffron, often catching her staring at him with an unreadable expression. One evening, as Saffron was helping Constance prepare dinner, she overheard a phone conversation between Everett and someone he called V. The intimate tone of his voice left no doubt in Saffron's mind that this was the other woman. Hearing the affection in her uncle's voice as he spoke to his lover ignited a fierce jealousy in Saffron that she could barely contain. That night, alone in her room, Saffron made a decision. She would expose Everett's affair, but not out of any sense of moral duty or concern for her aunt. Though Saffron's motivations were far more selfish and twisted, she convinced herself that by revealing the affair, she would be removing the other woman from the equation, leaving her free to pursue her own relationship with Everett. In her increasingly delusional state, Saffron began to reinterpret every interaction she'd ever had with her uncle. The proud smile he'd given her at her high school graduation, the long conversations they'd had about her future, the comforting hug he'd offered when she was upset, all of these took on new, inappropriate meanings in Saffron's mind. As she formulated her plan to confront Everett, Saffron's guilt and shame were overwhelmed by a toxic mix of desire and a misguided sense of entitlement. She had convinced herself that she understood Everett in a way no one else did, that they shared a special connection that transcended their familial relationship. Little did Saffron know that her descent into obsession was leading her down a path from which there would be no return. The once promising young journalist was now on a collision course with tragedy, driven by desires she barely understood and a jealousy that would ultimately prove fatal. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Saffron decided it was time to put her plan into action. Saffron found Everett in his study, poring over some blueprints for a new development. She knocked on the open door, her heart pounding so loudly Everett looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile that made Saffron's knees weak. "Everett, is it all right if I talk to you about something?" Saffron's voice quavered slightly as she spoke. Noticing her serious tone, Everett's expression shifted to one of concern. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Saffron closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. "I know about your affair, Uncle Everett." The color drained from Everett's face as he stared at his niece in shock. "I saw you that night you were supposed to be at the gala. I came home and saw you with her." She paused, gathering her courage for what she was about to say next. "And I want you to know that it's okay. I understand." Everett's shock turned to confusion. "This isn't something you should be involved in. It's complicated, and it's not what you think." Taking a step closer to her uncle, Saffron's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I think it's exactly what I think. You're not happy with Aunt Constance. You need someone who truly understands you, someone who can match your passion and ambition." With each word, she moved closer until she was standing directly in front of Everett's desk. Everett stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Saffron, this conversation needs to end right now. You're my niece, and what you're implying is completely inappropriate." But Saffron was too far gone in her delusion to heed the warning in Everett's voice. In a move that would forever alter the course of both their lives, she circled the desk and pressed herself against him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Everett looked down at his niece, a mix of emotions playing across his face. Shock, anger, and something darker that Saffron mistook for desire. Then, with a forceful push, he shoved her away from him. "What do you think you're doing? Have you lost your mind?" The rejection hit Saffron like a physical blow. She stumbled backwards, her face flushing with humiliation and anger. Neither of them could have known in that moment how this confrontation would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. The lines had been crossed and there was no going back. In the days following the confrontation, an uneasy tension settled over the Callahan household. Saffron avoided Everett as much as possible, shame and anger warring within her. Everett, for his part, seemed determined to pretend nothing had happened, maintaining a facade of normalcy that only heightened Saffron's distress. It was on a Friday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the incident in the study, that everything changed. Constance had taken the children to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving Everett and Saffron alone in the house. Saffron had been planning to spend the evening out with friends, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. As she was heading out the door, Everett called out to her. "Saffron, can we talk for a moment?" Everett gestured for her to join him in the living room. "I think we need to clear the air about what happened." Saffron sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her body tense. "I'd rather not talk about it. Can we just forget it ever happened?" Everett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't think we can." Something in his tone made Saffron look up, meeting his eyes for the first time in weeks. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Gone was the anger and disgust she had expected. Instead, she saw a mixture of guilt, desire, and resignation that mirrored her own conflicted emotions. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. Everett moved closer, his voice low and intense. "This is wrong, Saffron. We both know it's wrong. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." What followed was a passionate, frenzied encounter that left them both breathless and filled with equal parts exhilaration and shame. As they lay tangled together on the sofa, the full weight of what they had done began to settle over them. In the weeks that followed, Everett and Saffron engaged in a dangerous dance of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. They both knew what they were doing was wrong, that it could destroy their family if anyone ever found out. But the thrill of their forbidden relationship, combined with the genuine affection and understanding they shared, proved too addictive to give up. Little did they know that their illicit affair was building towards a catastrophic conclusion. The web of lies and betrayal they were weaving would soon unravel with deadly consequences. As Everett and Saffron's secret relationship intensified, the atmosphere in the Callahan home grew increasingly strained. Constance, though unaware of the true nature of the situation, sensed that something was amiss. She noticed the furtive glances between her husband and niece, the way they seemed to tense up when in the same room together. The situation came to a head one Saturday afternoon when Constance walked in on Everett and Saffron in what appeared to be an intense, whispered argument. They sprang apart as soon as they noticed her, but Constance had seen enough to arouse her suspicions. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice laced with concern and a hint of accusation. Saffron mumbled something about a disagreement over a business proposal before hurrying from the room. Everett attempted to smooth things over, claiming he had been giving Saffron advice about her career prospects, but Constance remained unconvinced. From that moment on, Constance began to pay closer attention to her husband and niece's interactions. She noticed how they always seemed to be in the same room, how their conversations would abruptly cease when she entered. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house became palpable. Family dinners, once a time of lively conversation and laughter, became stilted affairs filled with awkward silences and forced small talk. Constance's attempts to draw out what was wrong were met with deflection from Everett and evasion from Saffron. Unbeknownst to all, the carefully constructed facade of the Callahan family was beginning to crack. The truth, with all its ugly implications, was threatening to burst forth. And when it did, the consequences would be devastating. As autumn gave way to winter, Everett Callahan found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. The initial thrill of his affair with Saffron had long since faded, replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. The pressure was coming from all sides. Veronica, unaware of his dalliance with Saffron, had begun to push for more commitment. She wanted him to leave Constance, to start a new life with her. Her patience was wearing thin, and her threats to expose their affair were becoming more frequent and more serious. At home, Constance's suspicions had not abated. Her once trusting nature had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness that set Everett's nerves on edge. He caught her checking his phone when she thought he wasn't looking, noticed her questioning glances when he came home late from work. But it was Saffron who posed the greatest threat. What had begun as a misguided infatuation on her part had evolved into something far more dangerous. She had become possessive, jealous not just of Constance but of Veronica as well. Her demands for Everett's time and attention were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. One particularly tense evening, after a close call where Constance had nearly walked in on them in a compromising position, Everett tried to end things with Saffron. "This has to stop," he had told her. Saffron's eyes had flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You can't end this, I won't let you. If you try to leave me, I'll tell everyone what we've done." The threat hung in the air between them, and Everett felt the last vestiges of control slipping away from him. He was trapped, caught between three women, each holding a piece of his destruction in their hands. The night that would change everything started like any other. The Callahan family had just finished dinner, with Constance and the children settling in for a movie night. Everett begged off, claiming he had work to finish in his study. Saffron too excused herself, saying she had plans with friends. But Saffron had no intention of going out that night. Instead, she waited until she was sure the rest of the family was engrossed in their movie before slipping into Everett's study. She found him at his desk, his head in his hands. "We need to talk," Saffron said, closing the door behind her. Saffron moved closer, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and determination. "You need to choose her or me. I won't be your little secret anymore." In that moment, looking at Saffron's face twisted with jealousy and desperation, Everett saw his entire life crumbling before his eyes. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was about to be torn apart by this girl's misguided obsession. Something inside Everett broke. With a roar of frustration and fear, he lunged at Saffron, his hands closing around her throat. He wanted to stop her, to silence the threats that were destroying his world. But once he started, he couldn't stop. Saffron's eyes widened in shock and fear as she clawed at his hands, trying to break free. But Everett was stronger, his grip fueled by panic and adrenaline. It was over in minutes. Saffron's struggles weakened, then ceased altogether. When Everett finally came to his senses and released his grip, she crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The discovery of Saffron's body sent shockwaves through the Callahan household and the wider community. It was Constance who found her, alerted by the unusual silence from Everett's study. Her scream of horror brought the children running, and within minutes the house was swarming with police and paramedics. Everett, in a state of shock, had been found sitting in his chair staring blankly at Saffron's body. He offered no resistance as the police led him away, his silence interpreted as stunned grief by the officers on the scene. Detective Lena Kirka, a veteran of the police department's Homicide division, was assigned to lead the investigation. From the moment she stepped into the Callahan home, she sensed that this case was far more complex than a simple home invasion gone wrong, which was the initial theory. As she interviewed the family members, inconsistencies began to emerge. Constance, while devastated, seemed to be harboring suspicions about her husband. The children, Rowan and Ivy, spoke of increasing tension in the house over the past few months, particularly between Everett and Saffron. But it was Everett's behavior that raised the most red flags for Detective Kirk. His effect was flat, his responses to questions vague and evasive. He claimed to have been working in his study all evening, not hearing anything until Constance's scream. But the medical examiner also found evidence of sexual activity shortly before Saffron's death. This revelation cast the case in a new, disturbing light. As Detective Kirk dug deeper, she began to uncover a web of secrets and lies that ran through the heart of the Callahan family. The picture-perfect facade was crumbling, revealing dark truths that would shock the community to its core. As the investigation into Saffron's murder intensified, Detective Kirk and her team began to piece together the complex puzzle of relationships and secrets within the Callahan family. Each new revelation brought them closer to the shocking truth. A breakthrough came when forensics recovered deleted text messages from Saffron's phone. The messages revealed a passionate, illicit relationship with an older man, referred to only as E. The content of the messages left little doubt that E was Everett Callahan. Armed with this information, Detective Kirk brought Everett in for another round of questioning. Faced with the evidence, Everett's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. He admitted to the affair with Saffron, but vehemently denied killing her, claiming that their relationship had been consensual and that he loved his niece. However, Everett's story was further complicated when Veronica Ashworth came forward. Initially reluctant to involve herself in the investigation, Veronica finally revealed her long-standing affair with Everett after being confronted with evidence linking her to him. Her testimony painted a picture of a man torn between multiple relationships, struggling to keep his various secrets from colliding. Meanwhile, a more thorough search of the Callahan home uncovered a journal hidden in Saffron's room. The entries detailed her growing obsession with her uncle, her discovery of his affair with Veronica, and her plan to confront him on the night of her death. The final entry, dated the day she died, contained a chilling line. "Tonight everything changes, he'll have to choose her or me." This evidence, combined with the forensic analysis of the crime scene, began to paint a clear picture of what had transpired on that fatal night. DNA evidence found under Saffron's fingernails matched Everett's, indicating a struggle. Fibers from Everett's clothing were found on Saffron's body, contradicting his initial statement that he hadn't been in close contact with her that evening. As the case against Everett built, other witnesses came forward. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from the Callahan house on the night of the murder. A colleague of Everett's mentioned his increasingly erratic behavior at work in the weeks leading up to Saffron's death. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Constance. After days of questioning and faced with the mounting evidence of her husband's infidelity, she finally broke down. She revealed that she had suspected something was going on between Everett and Saffron for weeks. On the night of the murder, she had overheard part of their argument, but had been too afraid to intervene. As Detective Kirk compiled all the evidence, a timeline of events emerged. Saffron had confronted Everett about his affair with Veronica, threatening to expose both relationships if he didn't choose her. In a moment of panic and rage, Everett had strangled Saffron, then attempted to cover up his crime. The case, which had once seemed like a tragic home invasion, had unraveled into a sordid tale of forbidden desire, jealousy, and ultimately, murder. The respected Callahan family, once the picture of suburban success, now stood exposed as a web of lies and betrayal. The courtroom was packed each day as the prosecution laid out its case, painting a picture of a man whose web of lies and illicit relationships had finally caught up with him. Prosecutor presented a compelling narrative. Weaving together the physical evidence, witness testimonies, and the damning contents of Saffron's journal, she portrayed Everett as a manipulative predator who had taken advantage of his young, vulnerable niece, then killed her in a fit of rage when she threatened to expose him. Everett's defense team attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that the physical evidence was circumstantial and that Saffron's journal entries were the fantasies of a troubled young woman. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Everett himself took the stand. Under intense cross-examination, he finally admitted to his affair with Saffron but continued to deny killing her. His emotional breakdown on the stand as he begged for forgiveness from his family left many in the courtroom stunned. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned final arguments. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. In a moment of high drama, the foreman stood and declared Everett Callahan guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Everett to 25 years to life in prison, bringing a close to a case that had shocked and captivated the nation. The Callahan tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The family's once pristine reputation was in tatters, their name forever associated with scandal and murder. Remington Harlow, a successful software engineer, and his wife Cordelia, a talented interior designer, were the picture of marital bliss to their friends and neighbors. Their home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, stood as a testament to their seemingly perfect life. But beneath the surface, a dark current was stirring. Remington's growing fascination with a taboo fantasy would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter their idyllic existence and end in tragedy. What began as a consensual exploration of desires would spiral into a maelstrom of jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Remington Harlow was born in 1985 to a middle-class family in Eugene. From an early age, he displayed a keen intellect and a fascination with computers. His parents, both educators, nurtured his interests, and by the time he entered high school, Remington was already coding his own programs. Despite his academic prowess, he struggled socially, often feeling awkward and out of place among his peers. Cordelia Astor, born in 1987, grew up in a wealthy family in Seattle, Washington, the youngest of 3 children. She was vivacious and creative from the start. Her parents, successful real estate developers, provided her with every opportunity, including art classes and interior design courses. Their paths crossed in 2005 at Reed College in Portland. Remington, a junior computer science major, literally bumped into Cordelia, a freshman art student in the campus library. He was immediately smitten by her radiant smile and effortless charm. Cordelia, in turn, found herself drawn to Remington's quiet intensity and brilliant mind. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual discussions, late-night coding sessions, where Cordelia would sketch while Remington typed, and explorations of Portland's eclectic art scene. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they found in each other a perfect complement. They married in 2009, shortly after Cordelia's graduation. The wedding, held in a picturesque vineyard in the Willamette Valley, was a joyous affair that seemed to portend a bright future. Remington had already secured a high-paying job at a tech startup in Portland, while Cordelia began to make a name for herself in the city's competitive interior design market. For the first few years of their marriage, life seemed perfect. They bought their dream home in Oak Ridge, traveled the world, and built a wide circle of friends. Remington's career soared as he climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming a senior engineer at a tech firm. Cordelia's design business flourished, with her work featured in several magazines. From the outside, the Harlows appeared to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a strong, loving marriage. But as they entered their 30s, subtle cracks began to form in their seemingly flawless facade, setting the stage for the tumultuous events to come. As the Harlows approached their 10th wedding anniversary, a restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but sometimes monotonous glow. Remington, always introspective, found himself increasingly drawn to online forums and discussions about alternative sexual lifestyles. It started innocently enough, a curiosity about what other couples did to spice up their love lives. But as Remington delved deeper into these virtual communities, he became particularly fascinated by the concept of cuckolding. The idea of watching his wife with another man, of being a voyeur to her pleasure, awakened something within him. At first, Remington kept these thoughts to himself, ashamed and confused by the intensity of his desires. He would stay up late, ostensibly working, but in reality he was consuming every piece of cuckold-related content he could find. Cordelia, perceptive as ever, sensed the change in her husband. She noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over during their conversations, the increased frequency of his late nights at the computer. Concerned, she gently probed, asking if everything was all right if work was becoming too stressful. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Remington decided to broach the subject with Cordelia. One evening over a bottle of wine, he haltingly confessed his newfound interest. He spoke of his desires, his curiosity about exploring this fantasy, all the while watching Cordelia's face for signs of disgust or rejection. To his surprise and relief, Cordelia didn't recoil. Instead, she listened with an open mind, asking thoughtful questions about what exactly appealed to him about this scenario. While she expressed initial reservations, she also admitted to a certain intrigue the idea of being desired by another man, of being the center of attention, held its own allure. This conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. What had been a private fantasy for Remington was now out in the open, a possibility to be explored together. Neither of them could have predicted the profound impact this revelation would have on their lives, or the dangerous path it would ultimately lead them down. The Harlows' foray into the world of cuckolding began cautiously. They set ground rules, discussed boundaries, and agreed to take things slowly. But finding the right person to introduce into their marriage proved challenging. They wanted someone attractive and charismatic, but also discreet and respectful of their arrangement. Enter Thaddeus Blackwood. Cordelia met him at a charity art auction in downtown Portland. Tall with piercing green eyes, Thaddeus exuded a magnetic charm that drew people to him. As the owner of a successful art gallery, he moved effortlessly through Portland's cultural elite, his wit and knowledge making him the center of attention at any gathering. Cordelia was immediately drawn to Thaddeus's sophisticated aura. They spent the evening in animated conversation about emerging artists and the latest trends in interior design. When Thaddeus casually mentioned being unattached and open to new experiences, Cordelia felt a spark of excitement. She relayed her encounter to Remington that night, watching his eyes light up as she described Thaddeus. They agreed that he might be the perfect candidate for their exploration. Remington encouraged Cordelia to nurture the connection, his excitement palpable. Over the next few weeks, Cordelia and Thaddeus met for coffee several times, ostensibly to discuss potential collaborations between his gallery and her design firm. Each time, Cordelia returned home to regale Remington with stories of their encounters, stoking the flames of his fantasy. Finally, after a particularly flirtatious meeting, Cordelia decided it was time to broach the subject with Thaddeus. To her surprise and delight, he was intrigued by the proposition. He admitted to having participated in similar arrangements before and understood the delicacy required. With Thaddeus on board, the stage was set for the Harlows to turn fantasy into reality. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably change their lives. The night of the first encounter arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excited anticipation. Remington and Cordelia had spent weeks planning every detail, from the ambient lighting in their bedroom to the bottle of expensive champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Thaddeus arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, looking dashing in a tailored charcoal suit. He brought with him a bouquet of exotic flowers for Cordelia and a rare bottle of scotch for Remington, a gesture that impressed them both with its thoughtfulness. The evening began in the living room with drinks and light conversation. Thaddeus regaled them with stories from the art world, his charisma on full display. Cordelia, dressed in a slinky black dress, laughed at his jokes and touched his arm with increasing frequency. Remington watched from his armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his heart racing with every interaction between his wife and their guest. As the night progressed and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew charged with sexual tension. Finally, with a meaningful look at Remington, Cordelia took Thaddeus by the hand and led him upstairs. In the bedroom, Remington settled into a corner armchair as Cordelia and Thaddeus began to kiss passionately. When Thaddeus and Cordelia finally fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Remington felt a potent mix of arousal and an unexpected twinge of jealousy. The encounter itself was intense and passionate. Remington watched, transfixed, as his fantasy played out before his eyes. The reality was more visceral, more overwhelming than he had imagined. Afterwards, as they all lay spent and silent, Remington felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. His long-held fantasy had been realized. But there was also a nagging sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Thaddeus left shortly after, with promises to stay in touch. As Remington and Cordelia lay in bed, discussing the evening's events in hushed, excited tones. Neither could have predicted how this first encounter would set the stage for the tragedy to come. They had opened Pandora's box, and there would be no closing it again. Encouraged by the success of their first foray into cuckolding, they eagerly arranged more meetings with Thaddeus. What had started as a monthly indulgence quickly became then weekly. Each encounter seemed to push the boundaries further, with Thaddeus staying longer, the sessions growing more intense and intimate. Remington's role began to evolve as well. Cordelia said in an interview that he was initially content to watch from afar. He found himself drawn closer to the action. Sometimes he would join in, and that the dynamics of power and control within their bedroom became increasingly complex. Outside of their encounters, Thaddeus began to integrate more into their lives. He would join them for dinner, accompany Cordelia to art exhibitions, even spend weekends at their home. His charm and wit made him a delightful companion, and the Harlows found themselves enjoying his company even when action wasn't on the agenda. As spring turned to summer, Remington's initial excitement began to give way to a gnawing sense of discomfort. He started to notice small but significant changes in Cordelia's behavior. She seemed distracted during their alone time, her mind elsewhere. She began to dress up more often, even on days when they had no plans with Thaddeus. One evening, Remington came home early from work to find Cordelia on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call claiming it was just a client. But Remington couldn't shake the feeling that she had been talking to Thaddeus. In bed, Cordelia's passion seemed to have cooled. She was still enthusiastic during their encounters with Thaddeus. But alone with Remington, she often seemed tired or disinterested. Remington found himself initiating sex more often, only to be gently rebuffed. Remington tried to reassert control over the situation. He suggested taking a break from their arrangement, perhaps going on a vacation, just the two of them. But Cordelia seemed reluctant, always finding reasons to delay or change the subject. His work began to suffer as he spent hours analyzing every interaction, every text message, every glance between Cordelia and Thaddeus. He started checking Cordelia's phone when she wasn't looking, scrutinizing her social media activity, even contemplating following her when she went out alone. Remington knew he was spiraling, but he felt powerless to stop it. The game he had initiated was slipping out of his control, and he was terrified of losing Cordelia. As his anxiety grew, so did his determination to put an end to the situation he had created, by any means necessary. The breaking point came on a warm July evening. Remington had planned a romantic dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Cordelia and discuss his growing concerns. He had left work early, bought her favorite wine, and spent hours preparing an elaborate meal. But as the sun began to set and the candles burned low, Cordelia was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours ticked by, the carefully prepared food growing cold on the table. When she finally stumbled in shortly before midnight, her hair disheveled and lipstick smudged, Remington's worst fears seemed confirmed. The argument that ensued was explosive. Remington, his emotions amplified by alcohol and hours of anxious waiting, unleashed all the fears and suspicions he'd been harboring. He accused Cordelia of falling in love with Thaddeus, of making a fool of him, of destroying their marriage. Cordelia, caught off guard and defensive, initially tried to deflect. She claimed she'd lost track of time at a client meeting, that her phone had died. But faced with Remington's relentless questioning and the evidence of her appearance, she finally broke down and admitted she had been with Thaddeus. The confession hit Remington like a physical blow. He had suspected, had feared, but hearing it confirmed shattered something inside him. In that moment, all the excitement and thrill of their arrangement went away. Cordelia, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain. She loved Remington, she insisted, but Thaddeus made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was confused, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deepening emotions for Thaddeus. Remington, his voice low and dangerous, demanded that she end things with Thaddeus immediately. Cordelia, her own anger rising, refused. This had been Remington's idea in the first place, she argued. He couldn't dictate her feelings or control her relationships. The argument escalated, with both of them saying hurtful things they would later regret. Remington, in a moment of rage, smashed a wine glass against the wall. Cordelia, shocked by this uncharacteristic display of violence, retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind her. Remington spent the night on the couch, his mind racing, unable to sleep. In the days following their confrontation, a chilling calm settled over the Harlow household. Cordelia and Remington moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking, the tension palpable. Cordelia spent most of her time out of the house, throwing herself into her work, and Remington suspected meeting with Thaddeus. Remington, for his part, retreated into a dark place within himself. He called in sick to work, spending his days in a haze of alcohol and paranoid thoughts. He scoured Cordelia's computer and phone for evidence of her relationship with Thaddeus, meticulously documenting every text, every call, every unexplained absence. Remington began to fantasize about confronting Thaddeus, about making him pay for destroying his marriage. At first, these were just harmless daydreams, a way to vent his frustration. But as the days wore on and Cordelia grew more distant, these fantasies took on a darker, more violent tone. One afternoon, while Cordelia was at a client meeting, Remington found himself in their garage holding the heavy wrench he used for home repairs. As he felt its weight in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. It should be so easy to end this and to eliminate the threat to his marriage once and for all. Horrified by the direction of his thoughts, Remington dropped the wrench and fled the garage. But the seed had been planted. As he paced the house, gulping down glasses of whiskey, the idea took root and grew. By the time night fell, what had started as a fleeting, horrifying thought had crystallized into a plan. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Remington woke early, his head pounding from another night of heavy drinking, but his resolve unwavering. Today would be the day he confronted Thaddeus, the day he reclaimed control over his life and his marriage. He spent the morning in a feverish state of preparation. He showered, shaved, and dressed with meticulous care, as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than the violent confrontation he was planning in the garage. He selected the wrench he had held days earlier, wrapping it in a towel and placing it in a nondescript gym bag. Cordelia left for work around 9 a.m., barely acknowledging Remington as she rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, Remington got into his car and drove to Thaddeus' gallery. He parked across the street, watching as Thaddeus arrived, greeting his employees with his characteristic charm. For hours, Remington sat in his car. As closing time approached, Remington watched Thaddeus bid goodbye to his last customer and begin closing up the gallery. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With shaking hands, he grabbed the gym bag and crossed the street. Thaddeus was locking the gallery door when Remington approached. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a wary smile. "Remington," he said, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Remington felt a surge of rage at Thaddeus' casual tone, as if he hadn't been destroying Remington's life for months. Without conscious thought, he swung the gym bag, catching Thaddeus off guard and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Remington pulled out the wrench, swinging it wildly as Thaddeus tried to defend himself. But Remington was beyond reason. Every blow was fueled by months of jealousy, insecurity, and rage. When it was over, Remington stood panting over Thaddeus's motionless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had just killed a man. He had just destroyed his own life in a futile attempt to save it. Remington went through the motions of covering his tracks. He dragged Thaddeus' body into the alley behind the gallery, hiding it behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he might have touched. Then, still in a state of shock, he drove home, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shroud. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. As Remington pulled into his driveway, the rain washing away the blood on his hands, but doing nothing to cleanse his conscience. The hours following the murder passed in a nightmarish blur for Remington. He stumbled into the house, barely making it to the bathroom before violently emptying the contents of his stomach. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of his actions hit him. He had killed a man. He was a murderer, operating on autopilot. Remington set about destroying evidence. He burned his clothes in the backyard fire pit, scrubbed the car clean, and took a shower. When Cordelia came home, Remington had composed himself enough to feign normalcy. He greeted her with forced cheerfulness, suggesting they order takeout and watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, the TV flickering unwatched, Remington's mind erased. He knew it was only a matter of time before Thaddeus's body was discovered. He needed an alibi, a story to tell when the inevitable questions came. He casually mentioned to Cordelia that he had spent the day at home catching up on work and doing some yard work. He even showed her a small cut on his hand, claiming he had nicked himself while pruning the rose bushes, a cut that had actually come from his struggle with Thaddeus. 2 days after the murder, the news broke. Thaddeus Blackwood, prominent art dealer and fixture of Portland's cultural scene, had been found dead behind his shop. The police were treating it as a homicide. Remington learned of the discovery while at work, overhearing colleagues discussing the shocking news. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands shaking so badly he had to excuse himself to the restroom. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Eliana Rossi, a veteran of the Police Bureau's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She and her team combed through Thaddeus' life, interviewing friends, family, and business associates. It didn't take long for them to uncover Thaddeus' relationship with the Harlows. Cordelia, devastated by the news of Thaddeus' death, initially tried to downplay their connection, but faced with evidence from Thaddeus' phone records and witness accounts, she eventually admitted to their affair. When the police came to interview Remington, he was prepared. He expressed shock and sadness at Thaddeus' death, acknowledging that while their arrangement had been unconventional, he had considered Thaddeus a friend. He calmly recounted his movements on the day of the murder, his story aligning perfectly with what he had told Cordelia. Detective Rossi, however, sensed something off about Remington's demeanor. His calm seemed forced, his grief a touch too performative. She made a mental note to dig deeper into his background and movements. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together a timeline of Thaddeus' last day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him entering the gallery in the morning but never leaving. His last phone call had been to Cordelia, ending abruptly around closing time. The net was slowly closing around Remington. As the days turned into weeks, Cordelia's grief over Thaddeus' death deepened. She threw herself into her work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the stilted silences that now characterized her home life with Remington. At first, Remington's attentiveness in the wake of the tragedy had touched her. He seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, always ready with a comforting word or a shoulder to cry on. But as time passed, she began to notice inconsistencies in his behavior. Cordelia found herself revisiting the events leading up to Thaddeus' death. She remembered Remington's jealousy, his desperate pleas for her to end the affair. The more she thought about it, the more a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. She started paying closer attention to Remington's actions, noting when he left the house, checking his browser history when he wasn't around. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to take that final step. As her suspicions grew, so did her fear. If Remington was capable of what she was beginning to suspect, what else might he be capable of? For the first time in their marriage, Cordelia found herself afraid of her husband, unsure of the man she had promised to love. For better or worse, the breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless man known to frequent the alley behind Thaddeus's gallery came forward with information. He claimed to have seen a man matching Remington's description entering the alley on the night of the murder, carrying a gym bag. This new lead energized the investigation. Detective Rossi and her team began to scrutinize Remington's movements more closely. They discovered traffic camera footage that contradicted his alibi, showing his car near the gallery around the time of the murder. As the evidence mounted, Remington's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, snapping at colleagues, and becoming paranoid about being followed. Cordelia, her own suspicions now seeming confirmed, began to distance herself from him, staying with a friend under the guise of needing space to grieve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police, armed with a search warrant, found small traces of blood in Remington's car that matched Thaddeus' DNA. They also discovered the murder weapon, the blood-stained wrench that Remington had hidden in the attic, unable to bring himself to dispose of it completely, on a rainy September morning. Nearly a month after Thaddeus' death, Detective Rossi arrived at the Harlow residence with a team of officers. They found Remington sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. As the detective read him his rights, Remington offered no resistance. In that moment, he felt an odd sense of relief. The game was over. The lies, the fear, the constant vigilance could all stop now. Remington Harlow's trial was brief but sensational. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. His confession a rambling account of jealousy, fantasy, and fatal obsession. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Cordelia, shattered by the revelation of her husband's actions, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. She sold their house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved out of state to start a new life.